happy to introduce to you Professor Cristina Iuli, who is my good friend and colleague and a wonderful scholar. She teaches, or she's an assistant professor of American literature at the University of Piedmont Orientale in Vercelli, in Italy, and also teaches in Turin. She specializes in 20th century contemporary American literature theory, literature and science, and on theories and aesthetics of modernity. She has published, I just found out that she has 2 PhDs, one from the University of Bergamo and the other one from Bloomington University of Indiana in Bloomington. She has published 3 books. One of them is called Effetti Teoretici on cultural theory and literary history. The other one is called Giusto il tempo di esplodere, published on Nathaniel West, published by Bergamo University Press, and Spell It Modern, Modernity and the Question of Literature, published in 2009. She's now finalizing a book project on the ideology. She's finalizing a book with The Human is the Limit, so this is the new project. The Human is the Limit, Modernity and the Ideology of the Human in late American Modernism, Kenneth Burke, Nathaniel West, and Richard Wright. This last one engages with late modernist aesthetics and the ideology of the human from a systems theoretical perspective, heavily influenced by the cybernetic theories of the mid-20th century. Thank you so much for coming, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for having me here. I'm very happy to try to rehearse this paper that it's actually a shorter version of a longer study, but I hope I'm going to skip some passages, so I hope it will still be clear. My purpose here is to try to reflect on the recent turn toward transatlanticism that American studies has taken, especially the study of American literature, but also American history, and to reflect on what that means and what kind of implication it has and what sources it relies, and how it distinguishes itself from previous versions of transatlanticism. Of course, the notion of transatlanticism refers to the passage, the link, the connections between the Anglo-Atlantic world, the rest of the world, and the American continent. And by the rest of the world, or the Anglo world, I mean either the relationships between England, old England, or the United Kingdom, and what came to be the United States, or a larger view that also includes the whole European nation, Atlantic trajectories that but that include the African continent, and then crossed the ocean and went to the American continent. So there are 2 versions. One is a sort of a narrower version, and the other one is an expanded version. I would like to start with a quotation. There are a few quotations that I like to present to you, and the first one is from a wonderful novel that is The Brief Wanderer's Life of Oscar Wilde. It's a 2003 novel published by Junos Diaz. Many of you probably have read this novel, but I hope you can read the quote. I will move the pointer around so that you can actually read it. I start with this quotation, which is the beginning of the novel, because it really situates the early stages of what we know as conquest, the American continent, in the conquest, in the Admiral, who is Christopher Columbus' voyage to what were called then the West Indies. They say it came first from Africa, carried in the screams of the enslaved, that it was the death bane of the Taínos, after just as one world perished and another began, that it was a demon drawn into creation through the nightmare door that was cracked open in the Antilles. Fuku Americanus, Of course, you can also read that word, fuck you, right? Fuku or fuck you, Americanos, or more colloquially, fuku, generally a curse or a doom of some kind, specifically the curse and the doom of the New World, also called the fuku of the Admiral, because the Admiral was both his midwife and one of his great European victims. Despite discovering the New World, the Admiral died miserable and syphilitic, hearing Dike, divine voices. In Santo Domingo, the land he loved best, what Oscar is the protagonist at the end, would call the ground zero of the New World. The Admiral's very name has become synonymous with both kinds of fuku, literal and large. To say his name aloud, or even to hear it, is to invite calamity on the heads of you and yours. But the fuku ain't just ancient history, a ghost story from the past with no power to scare. In my parents' day, the fuku was real as shit, something your everyday person could believe in. Everybody knew someone who had been eaten by a fuku, just like everybody knew somebody who worked up in the Palacio. It was in the air, you could say. Though, like all most important things on the island, not something folks really talked about. But in those elder days, fuku had it good. It even had a hype man of sorts, a high priest, you could say. Our then dictator for life, Rafael Leonidas Trujillo Molina. Okay. The context of this quote is the conquest, the New World. I'm placing this paper, I'm placing this quote within what I'm starting to say, because it's part of a long history of revisions and revisions of revisions that have resituated American studies from a national project to a transnational project, post-national project, and finally a global or planetary project. So that as an effect of this of the past revisionist decades, the once dominant view of national literature as the expression of a homogeneous historical and geopolitical environment has increasingly appeared inadequate to describe the quote, fluid, irregular, multidirectional, and historically specific process of symbolic exchange, dissemination, and transformation that was generated by cultural and literary contact across waters and continents. In turn, such awareness has fueled a process of revision of critical methodologies, research directions, and pedagogical practices that is still in the making. I'd like to look at this process in relation to 3 points, to 3 elements. One is the emergence of a neo or new Atlantic Studies matrix. 2 is relation of this Atlantic Studies matrix to its subjects of knowledge and methodologies. How do we read text, and how does it affect our ways of writing literary histories or challenging the canon? And 3, its relation to what in literary studies we can call an archive, and what in historical studies is called sources. The reflection about the status of sources and archives and their relation with private and institutional memory, with how we remember and how we represent memories, is central to historical and literary disciplines and to the human sciences as a project about truth and commitment to what is proper to the human, both with respect to its past and to its future horizon. Whether they are understood as repositories of documents, monuments, affective reservoirs, or imaginary museums, archives are, before anything else, intellectual constructs and hypotheses about the future. They are, in other words, organizational strategies, procedures for collecting and subdividing culture by means of which we try to understand history by reconnecting it to specific social units. The idea of reconnecting histories to social units is an idea that the French Jesuit scholar Michel de Certeau used in his book about the writing of history. So studying archives and asking how they are defined in relation both to a certain exteriority, to what stands outside the archive, to the limit that by defining a space that they establish and exclude, they also mark. And also with reference to their internal principle of organization. This project, according to Desserteau, it's necessary in order to reconnect, quote, an object to a place, end of quote. That means to perform what he calls the first duty of historical epistemology, which also obviously means to understand history as the relation between a place, a set of analytical procedures, and the writing of a text. Archives, then, are also an expression of how people conceive of the relation between past, present, and future, and of how they conceive movements. There are movements, and the movements of their ancestors across temporal scales and among linguistic hierarchies and writing. The transatlantic or Atlantic studies matrix, this is my second, I just leave it on the, these are two quotations from an essay entitled The Atlantic Studies Matrix by William Boyle Howard. It was published on American Literary History in 2009. So this transatlantic or Atlantic Studies Matrix, as Boyle Howard defines it in an influential essay that summarizes its defining features by differentiating it from the dominant Anglo-American brand of old Atlanticism, has emerged from the convergence of a constellation of features: the waning of the Cold War political context, globalization, and the pressure to move beyond knowledge models based on the form of the nation-state, the emergence and dissemination of a post-colonial critical self-consciousness in academic cultural studies, the epistemological question of historical knowledge and the writing of history brought about by the discursive turn in literary and historical studies in the 80s and 90s, and the investment of a strong testimonial function to narratives of historical traumas, among which the African diaspora, the Middle Passage, the plantation system, modeled after the example of Holocaust studies. So all that process allowed for the emergence of the Atlantic as both a material and an imaginary figure. What Boyle Howard in the first quotation calls the apparatus, ultimately, is the apparatus, the dispositio, of the cartographic text, the map, representing a stratified and temporally rich skein of intersecting discursive and material trajectories across the Atlantic world. That cartographic text is what allows us to refer to the Atlantic studies research practices as a new disciplinary matrix. It is with this paradigmatic synthesis in mind that we should read the concept of transatlantic imaginary coined by Paul Giles to identify, quote, the interiorization of a literal or metaphorical Atlantic world in all its expansive dimensions. I'm skipping here a very long description of the different trajectories of transatlantic American studies, just because I just want to tell you that what seems to emerge provisionally as a crucial, provisionally, are two alternative ways of thinking about Atlantic studies. One expands the Anglo-Atlantic matrix, and it's the one that Paul Giles, the author of the last quotation, actually champions. So it's really a monolinguistic tradition. It works and expands and recontextualizes and discusses the set of relations and the history of publications between the United Kingdom and the United States. So it's monolinguistic and Anglo-Atlantic. It revises the tradition, but within that scope and within that limit. And another one that really takes the larger view of the transatlantic, and this second view is global by definition, and it has developed, especially in relation to the Middle Passage and the Atlantic slave trade, and also as a hemispheric project. And so, because of this more complex linguistic and cultural set of matrices, this project is also plurilinguistic. And also, it covers sort of stratification of temporal layers. What seems to emerge provisionally is a crucial difference in this alternative conceptualization of the Atlantic is the notion of the literary transatlantic as either a bidirectional conceptual unit, relatively well defined in historical, linguistic, geopolitical, and cultural terms, sedimented in time, or a less defined, more fluid entity conceived in wider relational terms as a fragment of the global literary world. Provided that both views imply interpretive strategies that are always site-specific, the first kind of Atlanticism relies on a methodology based in, quote, comparativist defamiliarization. On the contrary, the second kind demands a wider methodological frame consistent with the view that only by adopting a wider notion of the relations between transatlantic and world literary phenomena, it is possible to give more nuanced and comprehensive accounts of the complexities of the modern world system as it has emerged from the events of colonization. That is, a world multiplied in so many poles of exchange and reference, which in turn have brought into existence new phenomena and other poles of exchange and reference. Because it measures its explanatory ambitions in relation to the horizon of the modern world system, Atlantic history is, in the words of Alison Games, quote, a slice of world history, end quote. Similarly, and by extension, as a critical practice that sees its subject as an object that is also a space, the Atlantic Ocean and all that it holds, carries, and touches in time, transatlantic, Neo-Atlantic literary studies is also ambiguously situated between world history, geography, and history of cultures. So we don't have necessarily, or we don't have a privileged American context from which we can situate this transatlantic paradigm. We may be interested in the way in which it has affected American literary history, or the way in which we want to reconcile American literary history by taking that transatlantic paradigm into account. But it's not specifically American, even though it has been promoted intensely, I have to say, from within American studies, which itself has become more and more global.